When the Pharisees with some scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they observed that some of his disciples ate their meals with unclean, that is, unwashed, hands. For the Pharisees, and in fact all Jews, do not eat without carefully washing their hands, keeping the tradition of the elders. And on coming from the marketplace, they do not eat without purifying themselves. And there are many other things that they have traditionally observed, the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. So the Pharisees and scribes questioned him, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" And he responded, "Well did Isaiah prophesy about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines human precepts. You disregard God's commandment, but cling to human tradition.'" He summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile. From within people, from their hearts, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile." Thus far the Gospel of Mark. So he's answering the question that you asked.
Sure.
Because all of these things that he lists are things that are done in the body. They're also done in the body, but they require freedom, thought, intention. And so that's what he means by these are the things that defile. They were juxtaposing eating things that were not purified properly. That's taking something in from outside. Now, of course, if a person eats something to offend God, they're committing sin. But then that comes from the heart. So that's for us to make that distinction. We use the sacrament of reconciliation in the church. Our Lord gave us that gift of being able to reconcile with God when we have fallen into sin after baptism. And so using that sacrament helps us in two ways. One, it simply does help us to overcome sin. It absolves us from sins that we've committed. But two, when we use it regularly, and this is an important part of this, when we use it regularly, it helps us to actually grow in virtues, to grow in the opposite habits. The way to overcome sin, especially sinful habits, is to grow in the virtues.
It's beautiful. Yeah, this is an interesting gospel in that I find it interesting in just the sense that we're looking at, tradition, like, sort of, as it says, like, for Pharisees, and in fact, all Jews do not eat, without carefully wash their hands, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting because we reflect on that tradition. And so for those of us who, didn't sort of convert from, sort of traditional Judaism to Catholicism or something like that, it's like we need to sort of educate ourselves on what some of these things mean. But also at the end of this gospel, I just think it's interesting that Jesus says, sins from the heart, evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice. Like when I read those things, it's like he's talking about today. It's amazing how when I read those things, I'm like, oh, this is like 100% of what we are sort of dealing with today in the culture. Just hop on X, Twitter, formerly known as Twitter X, right. Or hop on, any of our media or politics and things that are going on that are really out there. they're not things that are, you know, sort of really in here all the time. I mean, those sins are, you know, can be present in our hearts, but man, you see it everywhere. If you're watching the news and you see what's going on, it's kind of interesting to me to see how similar it is to today.
In the pastoral letter, I talked about the banality in our culture, things that are banal in our culture. And, you know, banal means things that are old and trite and worn and not original. And all sin is that. All sin is banal. Sometimes people will ask priests if they hear new sins. And after you've been a priest for a little while hearing confessions, you don't really hear new sins, because sin is old. And the particular ways that we sin, they're not infinitely variable. They're basically old. What's always original, what's always new, what always stands out is holiness. You know, you might, if you're driving in traffic, are you going to notice the people who are honking the horn or cutting each other off and so forth? Or are you going to notice the people who are driving in a really courteous way, who let you cut into traffic when you need to and so forth? And that's what you notice. That's what seems original, unusual. If you go on to any of your favorite news feed, whatever it is, if you look at YouTube, if you look at postings on Facebook, if you see the headlines in the Tulsa World or anywhere else, trying to find something that's positive, that's optimistic, that's trying to build people up, it can be hard to do. It actually is hard to do. I have found, though, that you can Google search for good news stories about good things happening, things like that. And they are out there. You can find them, but editors don't seem to choose them. If it bleeds, it leads. You know, that's the old line.
That's right.
And so when Jesus is giving this list, every century can identify with this list, because there's nothing really new there. We're still doing the same things. Now, one thing that might be new, or at least each age would recognize some things that are new. Adultery, for example. Of course, at various points in time, that was just a really, really low, terrible thing that someone might do. It still is in its reality, but watch TV. TV doesn't treat it as if it's new, or movies or whatever. You know, if you love someone, you really should go after whoever you love.
Sure. Sort of what's maybe call it like the social norms. There's certain sins that maybe at different points in history,
right,
the larger public or the mob, if you will, would say, yeah, that is wrong. But then at other times they might culturally say, oh, actually, you know, that's not necessarily wrong.
The cultural things. Teaching as doctrines human precepts. Think about, for example, the way that politicians will talk about abortion as reproductive freedom, as women's rights. That's a human precept, freedom and rights. But doctrines, the doctrine of the sanctity of life is the doctrine. But now what they're teaching as doctrines are the precepts, reproductive freedom and so forth, and skipping over the actual doctrine of the right to life. So those are some examples of things in our own culture now. Blasphemy, that's something. Now let's see, he doesn't have on here calumny. Maybe it fits under blasphemy. But that's one of the things that this culture, I think, is very guilty of, is the way that we just blast each other on social media or whatever. You know, people are just so rude, so mean to each other in those forums in a way that they would never be in person. The things that people might say of someone in a forum, they would never say to them in person.
No.
There's a seeming anonymity within that.
And if they would say them in person, then my goodness, how far the culture has fallen. I mean, but I would agree. I mean, just my lived experience of just seeing what's online, and especially like social media and things like that, and how people are sort of what I call, keyboard warriors. But then when it comes to sort of interacting with people face to face,
or even supposedly defending the gospel, if you're defending the gospel by blasting people, then you're not doing the gospel any favors. You're proving that it's not working.
Yeah. Sin is always old, holiness is always new.